Good afternoon, everyone. Early evening, late afternoon. It's so dark, I feel like I should say good evening. My name is Professor Regine Jean-Charles. I'm a professor in the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures and African Diaspora Studies. I see one of my black feminism students cheering me, thank you. I wanted to remind you to please turn off your cell phones, anything that makes noise, and that there are surveys that we will be handing out at the end of the lecture. Oh, you should have received a survey, and we ask you to please fill those out. This is the second one of our lectures for the New Directions in African and African Diaspora Studies lecture series of 2014 and 2015. Our theme for this year is intersectionalities, so we're going to be thinking together about how race, class, gender, sexuality, and all the different locations of identity form a matrix of power. And our second speaker in the series is Dr. Lewis-McCoy. It is my pleasure to introduce him. Professor Lewis-McCoy is an associate professor of sociology and Black studies at the City College of New York. His research concentrates on issues of educational inequality, the role of race in contemporary society, and gender equity. He is the author of Inequality in the Promised Land, Race, Resources, and Suburban Schooling, which explores the experiences of low-income and racial minorities' attempts at accessing school-related resources. Using original data, he tackles the subtle and explicit ways that race and social class can affect the schooling opportunities of youth and their families in the post-civil rights era. In addition to its incisive insights on educational inequality, this groundbreaking book also presents valuable policy-oriented solutions for administrators, teachers, activists, and politicians. Professor Lewis-McCoy's commentary has been featured in media outlets such as U.S. World News Report, National Public Radio, Ebony, The Root, thegrio.com, and the Detroit Free Press. There's some more in there that aren't here. Through his writing, speaking, and commentary, his work analyzes some of the most pressing issues facing the African diaspora. With specializations in race and ethnic relations, his research and activism grapple with the areas of education, youth culture, and public policy. He exemplifies a model of intellectual life that couples thoughtful analysis and rigorous attention to method with genuine community engagement and commitment to justice-related issues. Some of his other works also help to demonstrate this point. By taking on topics such as confronting Black male privilege and the culture of femininity in relation to school success, Professor Lewis-McCoy demonstrates how he belongs to a tradition of feminist thinking, Black feminist thinking, that explores the intersections of race, class, and gender. The title for his talk, Still Left Behind, Gender and Class Exclusion in the Pursuit of African American Educational Justice, promises to do the same. I also just want to add that Professor Lewis-McCoy's work offers a really innovative and crucial perspective, especially in the context of how we talk about, think about, and conduct research on race, gender, and education today in this current moment that we're in. In view of the public attention to the Black male achievement gap, and whether through films such as American Promise or initiatives such as the White House-sponsored My Brother's Keeper, it is clear that too often the approach of these issues in both scholarship and policy are not inclusive. So it is really refreshing for me, and it will be for all of us, to see the work of a scholar whose approach to this topic takes into consideration the effects on boys and girls in a thoughtful and critical way. So please join me in welcoming him.
That was a beautiful introduction, like a really personal one. Usually people grab stuff off the website and they stumble over stuff, but Professor Jean-Charles has thankfully provided you with a personal take on the work. And I'm really excited to be here today with you and to bring you good weather and tidings from New York. And I hope today we can have some good conversations in addressing intersectionality and addressing education, and particularly the African American experience. And by the time we leave here today, I can't give it to you all, right? You can have most of it for $21. It's located right outside the door, right? Normally $24.95. Get that good BC discount. but I want to give you a taste of how I'm thinking around some of these issues. And I'm aware that some of you, thankfully, by virtue of folks like Professor Patel, have read some stuff from the book, but most of what I'll talk about today you won't find in the book, but some of it you will. So, with that being said, my talk today is called Who's Left Behind, and it has a really long title afterwards, which proves I'm an academic: Gender and Class Exclusion in the Pursuit of Educational Justice. When I decided to study schools, right, the first thing I set out to do was I said, one of the things we've been talking about for a while is the achievement gap. Has anyone heard of the achievement gap? You can raise your hand. Don't be shy about it. Okay, good. We're all on the same page. And most conversations around schooling seem to be fascinated and fixated on the achievement gap. And as I began to look for a site of study, and I told people I was interested in the achievement gap and I was interested in African Americans, they said, okay, so which city are you going to study? Is it going to be Chicago? Is it going to be Los Angeles? Is it going to be Boston? Which city are you going to study? And I said, I'm not going to study a city. And they were like, well, you can't be talking about black education and the achievement gap if you're not studying a city, right? And this was, for me, a number of years ago, very influential in my thinking, because I said, black folks have to exist in some places that are not only the city. And so I want to share with you a little bit about how I come to this work and how I approach it. So in 2006, I pulled up to a small blue ranch-style house nestled at the back of a crowded cul-de-sac, and I exited my Honda Civic. As I walked to the door, thinking about the interview I would shortly conduct, I surveyed the neighborhood and saw houses huddled around the oil-stained street. The homes sat with small front lawns that were manicured and maintained, yet not perfect. The street sat quiet with a few cars lining it and a basketball hoop facing the cul-de-sac. I rang the doorbell. I rang the doorbell again. The door opened and I was greeted by Miss Tolles, who was a jolly yet respect-inducing lawyer and mother of Jeffrey, who was a fourth grader at River Elementary School. She welcomed me into her home and introduced me to her house guest, who was another African-American woman in her late 40s. She introduced me by way of provocation. She said, "This is Mr. Lewis-McCoy. He's here to talk to Jeffrey, and he's here to solve the achievement gap." The laugh that you just gave was even louder from them. They both threw their heads back in laughter at the prospect of me solving the achievement gap. I assured them, as a researcher, I would not be solving their problems, but I would do my best to diagnose. For Ms. Tolles and her house guests, the conversation about solving the achievement gap had grown old. For many folks who have students in school, many educators as well as policy people, the conversation has been centered around the achievement gap, but we have very few solutions. What I want to do today is talk a little bit about how we can theorize around gender and education in the African American experience, as well as what are some of the things that are occurring in the process, not simply the outcome of test scores, that we should be considering. In our narratives around education, there are two things that come up quickly when talking about black education. There's the question of broken schools or broken children. The theory of broken schools, of course, centers on resource inequality, the ways in which urban areas have fewer dollars per individual or have accumulated a disadvantage over time. Even with more contemporary equitable funding structures, the history of inequality doesn't allow urban districts to have as many resources as suburban schools. In the broken schools theory, it centers on the idea that schools with resources are high performing. These schools are often seen to be suburban, assumed to be white, and assumed to be desirable. As I go on in my talk, you'll see that this is certainly not the case. The idea that we carry in our heads around schools, particularly suburban schools, is very reductive. The second argument that often comes to the forefront is the notion of broken children. That there is something endemic in the culture of African Americans that serves as a barrier to school success and achievement. Most significantly and famously forwarded by anthropologists like John Ogwu and Cynthia Fordham, the theory of the fear of acting white has been central to our discussion of African American education. The idea that young black folks see academic achievement as white, and rather than act white, they divest from educational practices and invest in peer relationships. In my time in the field, as well as many of the other studies I've done, I found very little evidence for actual academic disengagement among African Americans. I did, however, find evidence on the daily negotiations and hassles that they experienced at the hands of racism, classism, and sexism. When I think about broken schools and broken children, it's hard for me not to consider a policy, or an initiative that Professor Jean-Charles just mentioned, known as My Brother's Keeper Initiative. How many of y'all are familiar with that initiative? Okay. So a couple of months ago, about a term and a half into his presidency, President Obama stepped into the spotlight to speak about the ways in which the government had a role and a responsibility to target opportunities towards boys and men of color. The initiative that he created under a task force is known as My Brother's Keeper. Now, what's important about My Brother's Keeper is that it was announced as a White House initiative, it formed a task force, but importantly, it is something that came out of a philanthropic campaign. Prior to being part of the White House's plan, there was a study done of New York and trying to figure out how to generate dollars to work on the condition of African American males. When those funders came together and philanthropists came together under the guidance of the Ford Foundation, they said we need a concerted effort to concentrate dollars towards programs that work with black males. Following that, on the White House stage, the program was expanded to include black males and Latino males. Admittedly, Latino males are often absent from the discussion of My Brother's Keeper, but it's also equally important that you recognize that there are three key tasks of the My Brother's Keeper initiative. One, to get private philanthropists to give dollars towards the plight of males of color. Two, to collect information on the status of males of color. Three, to highlight and offer best practices for working with men and boys of color. Now, I want to say that there has been a good deal of discussion around the My Brother's Keeper, and I think the first thing we have to recognize is that this is not a set of government policies. This is government absolutely using its influence to request private dollars to solve public social problems. This is not an additional earmark on a budget. It says, hey, you, dig deep into your pockets and contribute to the welfare of men of color. It's important that we recognize that in many ways, this is an abdication of responsibility by the government to a set of its constituents. But despite that issue, there are greater issues that I think are important to consider when we think about the intersections of power and oppression. Soon after My Brother's Keeper was announced, there was a letter written and signed by over 200 men of color asking that the My Brother's Keeper initiative include girls and women of color. Full disclosure, I was one of those signees. Right? And soon after that, there was a letter of over 1,000 women of color requesting again that the White House consider having a parallel portion, known as My Sister's Keeper, that would concentrate resources to deal with issues that are faced by girls and women of color. These petitions immediately created a firestorm for a couple of reasons. One, when discussing the condition of African American males and boys, we have been invested in a narrative of crisis for over 35 years. Whether we go back to the work of Robert Staples or forward to Hakeem Adabusi, the idea that black males are single, dangerous, and obsolete is at the forefront of our minds. The question of why should we have to concentrate on girls and women of color when we know black males are in dire straits? A second critique came, and that many suggested that by petitioning President Obama, given that he has done less than what many have expected around race-targeted policies, by suggesting this initiative was uneven, we were literally undoing some race-based progress that could be made. And critics of this often said that you rarely get a president to say, I'm targeting people of color. Often the language is around class, often the language is around opportunity for all, but this is targeted. I think both of those critiques are interesting, but I think they misdirect the discussion. One of the things that is important about intersectionality, as laid out by Kimberly Crenshaw, right, and also laid out theoretically in relationship by Patricia O'Collins, is the idea that race, class, gender, and multiple identities interlock, and those systems of oppression create unique cells that impact everyone's experience. And I want to, as a sociologist, it is required by law that I show you some charts, so if y'all just bear with me. I'm going to show you a little bit about why it's important to recognize that everybody needs a keeper. This is a very basic graph of NAEP, also known as the Nation Report Card's trend data in 4th grade. On the top, what you're looking at up here are white males and white females. Pretty high on the scale score. Lower, you're looking at black males and black females. The biggest gap is not between black males and black females. It's between white and black, and it's a significant gap. Many folks who have suggested that black boys are in crisis have forgot to recognize that black girls are significantly far behind them. The same thing holds around reading in the 4th grade. In fact, the gaps you saw on the last chart are non-statistically significant, meaning black boys and girls score exactly the same in math, and there's a slightly greater gap in reading. But we're talking about small potatoes. If black boys are in trouble, it's hard to imagine black girls are not. As time goes on, this gap widens a little bit, but it really isn't that different. In our minds, we have been trained to think about the condition of African American males exclusively. It has led to a myopia of suggesting black boys face unique schooling problems and challenges that black girls do not. I would argue that it is essential as scholars that we reinterpret the gender frame as it relates to education. We have been misgendering the problem now for decades. We have been quick to suggest that if we are to compare the indicators and outcomes between black males and black females, then on every indicator, black females will come out better. A, this is simply not true. As Monique Morris in Black Stats points out, in several places, whether it's wealth inequality, where women of color outpace black males, whether it's eviction housing rates, where black women outpace black males, whether it's rates of intimate partner violence, where black women outpace black males, we know that both black males and black females are in trouble. I wouldn't necessarily call it crisis. So I would argue that it's absolutely important that we know the problem is not that black boys are in crisis. Instead, the problem is that black boys and girls face unique gender challenges that shape their separate and unequal schooling experiences relative to their white peers. In my presentation today, and I'm going to concentrate it for a reason because this is part of a larger project, right, on experiences of black boys. What I do want to make clear is that there is a parallel discussion happening about black girls. It's just in another paper. I won't hold y'all here all night, right? It's important that we don't look at it either or. The process of gender impacts everyone. The structures of school are impactful on race, class, and gender simultaneously. If we can start to think dynamically about the processes of class as well as the processes of race, I believe we can have a more balanced and influential set of policy interventions. One, that start with actual government initiatives. Right? For those who are unaware, our national education policy remains No Child Left Behind, right, of Bush fame. The only addition fundamentally we've had to federal policy is virtually a free market grant competition known as Race to the Top, which means those states and districts that are better able to prepare applications for funds of supplementing their educational opportunity receive more, which in the long run means schools and states and districts that have more resources get more of them, and those who have less get fewer. So one of the other things that I think is a big issue in the way in which we've been talking about education, particularly black education, is that we've missed the role of class. I mentioned earlier on when I decided to study African American education, there was an assumption that I would study a city. And don't worry, there are still black folks in cities. But part of the assumption is that black and low income are synonymous. While they are correlated, they are not perfectly correlated. While the distribution of income and wealth is certainly skewed between black and white, there are black folks for generations who have enjoyed middle class status, for generations who have been moving to suburban areas, and it's important that we do not leave them off of the radar. The discourse on Black education has been dominated by conversations about low-income Black families in the city. If traction is to be made, we have to look seriously at the multiple locations that compose the African American condition. So in the next section, what I'm going to do is take you to some of the work that I did. Actually, no, I'm not. I'm going to take you to this stat. This is important. Work with me. And it's not just me saying it, but we now know from our last set of census data that 50% of Black children grow up in neighborhoods where fewer than 20% of the residents are poor. If we exclusively concentrate on high poverty schools in urban areas, we miss half of the Black schooling experience. We now know that 51% of Black children raised in large metropolitan areas like Boston reside in suburban communities. If we're only talking about what's happening in the central city, we've missed the demographic change that's been ongoing for 40 years. For the most part, we've had conversations about Black middle class status, but it's been inside of cities. Work like Mary Patillo's Black Picket Fences is influential in this, right? But I think we have to marry not only middle class status, but also suburban status, and see what are the set of experiences that families have and go through in their pursuit of finding the best education for their family. I'm going to tell you about a place. This place is called Rollin Acres. Rollin Acres is not the real name of the place. I had someone who recently read the book, and there is now a Rollin Acres school district, and they contacted me and they said, I can't believe you could write about all those things about the racism and the exclusion, and Rollin Acres schools then get mad. I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. There's a footnote that says it's a pseudonym, right? Rollin Acres, to the outside world, right, and most of the white families in it, is an ideal location to raise families. It offers a melting pot of racial diversity, has a range of cultural offerings, it has high-performing schools. It's nestled in the Midwest and has about 100,000 folks in it. Rollin Acres is an oasis when it's compared to larger cities nearby that are plagued with failing schools, high crime rates, and deep poverty. Rollin Acres public schools serve about 16,000 students, and when I sat to observe them, I realized that even in the same classroom, you can have grossly different experiences. In the early 2000s, when I was in Rollin Acres, I attended a high school graduation for the district. During the ceremony, I heard white families cheering loudly as the names of schools were announced from the dais. These names ranged from places like Harvard, to Bates, to the University of Michigan, and the cheers were so loud for the college-going destinations that sometimes the future paths of their Black classmates were drowned out. Their Black classmates' college-going destinations and postgraduate plans read much more meagerly. Their destinations included community college, future work plans, military service, and a number of them went to colleges, but much less selective schools. Just as the cheers served to cover up the divergent life paths of Black and white youth, many of the mechanisms that breed inequality in Rollin Acres remain covered up. And while considerable attention has been paid to the gross inequalities between the inner city and suburban schools, too little research has interrogated the inequality within them. What happens when economically diverse students sit in the same classroom? What happens when racially diverse families are located in the same neighborhoods? The data that I draw from this presentation, there's a larger set of data that I collected over a 5-year period, which includes over 40 families, Black, white. I interviewed adults, I interviewed children, I sat in classrooms, I crammed myself into 4th grade chairs. I did archival research to look at how the district had talked about educational inequality, as well as looked at memorandum from the district and said, and tried to see what the policy response was. It's important to understand that Rollin Acres is a location that is desired. It's not a place that people often end up, it's a place that people select. And they often select it for their schools, for their children, because of the quality of schools. What I'm going to present now is coming from a paper in work called Boys in the Burbs. Y'all know what that's a play on? Boys of the, thank you. All right, I just want to make sure someone's alive and getting it right. And I think it's important that we understand that for black families in suburban areas, there were a particular set of gendered, race, and class concerns that they articulated. So the data you'll hear today is coming from parents, and as I mentioned, I have a parallel paper on the experiences of black girls. But today, hear me out. A central concern in urban education is social promotion. Social promotion is the idea of passing a student from one grade to the next, despite that student not meeting the necessary standards to move on. Social promotion is often argued from an underdevelopmental framework, suggesting students were better off by remaining with their peers than being held back. This practice was thought to be commonplace in urban areas, in large schools, and schools with high minority concentration. However, Rollin Acres public schools represent the opposite demographic portrait. In Rollin Acres, class size on average is about 27 kids. And while there are poor students, there are a smaller number of the poor. The Rollin Acres public schools routinely receive platitudes about high achievement and diverse offerings. But when I started to sit down and talk with African American parents about their experiences, they told me there was a whole other world that existed. In an interview with Mr. Downing, who was the father of 2 children, and a transportation supervisor, he discussed with me the issues that faced black students in Rollin Acres public schools. Mr. Downing, who he himself had grown up in the city of Rollin Acres, expressed concern about the academic treatment that his son received. He said, and I quote, "See, the fact that you got to come from a certain echelon of people in Rollin Acres to really see progression from the schools and the teachers. They don't really take a lot of time with some of the kids who, are low income, or some kids they think who have a bad attitude. They'd rather just, Johnny, do this, and that's all. They don't really put enthusiasm or give their child a little punch he needs to get over the hump, to help him along to develop, the attitude to press on, not only at school, but in life in general." Mr. Downing, like numerous black parents, were concerned that their children were perceived as outsiders at local schools. Despite having multi-generational residents, he felt that schools of his district valued more affluent families and tended to treat middle-class and lower-income black families as beneficiaries of the school system. This would be opposed to consumers of the school system. Beneficiaries were often those who would make requests of the system and have their requests rebuffed. They were then told to enjoy the district, it's a high-quality district, keep going. Consumers, on the other hand, made their requests of schools and had them met. Institutions sometimes met them with resistance, but would also often give in to those who they thought were valuable. It's important for a number of reasons, right? In the above quote, Mr. Downing stresses membership in a higher social class led to a more dynamic classroom engagement with the teacher and students from non-affluent backgrounds speaking, but they weren't engaged. It's important for a number of reasons. One, the process of triaging educational resources is often discussed in high poverty schools. It's discussed in high stakes testing. But in the day-to-day experience of the classroom, I often saw low-income students or black middle-class students receiving less contact with teachers, receiving less instructional feedback. While they were present, they were certainly receiving a separate education. Second, in Mr. Downing, in this case, he notes that a relative economic deprivation of black families, particularly how people perceived black families, played out on how they were treated. His quote suggests that for less well-off black families, while Rollin Acres schools are high-performing, they're not the target demographic. They're often an afterthought of what teachers want. Now, Mr. Downing's partner, Miss Downing, shared her perspective on schooling in Rollin Acres and teachers' attitude. She says, quote, "That's one thing about Rollin Acres. They'll pass a black person in a minute for them being slow. Like, they're just trying to get them out of the way. Move them on, get them out of the way. They ain't gonna be nothing. Go on, just let them graduate." For Miss Downing, she felt public schools held little regard for black children. Their well-being was not central to the schools. Instead, completion was. In an era of education in which accountability and graduation is paramount, quality of education sometimes gets lost. Miss Wolf, a mother of 4 children, black, white, biracial children, keyed in on how she felt that there was a dual local school system. Miss Wolf said, "So, I think in Rollin Acres, it's good and it's bad. I wouldn't really choose it over any other school district, but it's almost like if you want your kids to have a good education here, if they have any kind of learning problems, you have to really fight for it. Fight for them, like to really notice your child, and take the time to give them the special time that they need or the attention that they need. She continued on, well, it seems just almost a full-time job to have them go to school and have their teachers actually work. Ms. Wolf understood that the school system functioned well for some families, but when a student had special needs or other learning issues, the system was not easy to negotiate. In one of the classrooms I observed in the 4th grade, 50% of the black children had been identified as in need of special instruction. They had received IEPs. Now this was completely disproportionate to other white residents, but oftentimes African American parents were told the way to get specialized instruction was to accept a diagnosis and develop an individualized education plan. The consequence is they were set on a different educational track. Ms. Wolf and others were concerned that black boys in particular would be promoted without consideration of their educational needs. Ms. Wolf later talked to me about an experience with a neighbor's child who functionally had low levels of literacy but had graduated from the local high school. She was concerned because her children were going to the same schools. She said, how could he make it out of high school with such low levels of literacy? A second concern that was held by black parents, particularly black parents in thinking about black boys, was the notion that I call lumping black boys. In Rollin Acres, the achievement gap was a common term for residents, school staffs, as well as local media. While I was in the field, a week-long series of achievement gap articles in the local paper ran, and annually it stoked up fears and concern about the public image of Rollin Acres. Black parents, however, didn't really care that much about the achievement gap. In fact, black parents did two things. In their narratives about the achievement gap mattering, they suggested that the achievement gap was located outside of their house, that there were other black families that were failing and they were doing fine, or two, to suggest that the achievement gap was a distraction from the everyday racism that their children experience in school. I spoke to Ms. Turner, who was a mother of 3 children in Rollin Acres, 2 boys and 1 girl, and as a parent, she moved her older children between public and private schools. But their youngest son, Jason, she opted not to put him in the Rollin Acres public schools. Ms. Turner said, if you ask me honestly why I didn't take Jason to public school and didn't seriously look at it, it's because I think the public schools have failed black boys. 2 or 3 years ago, you could probably dig up this article where it said that 2/3 of black boys have a 2.8 GPA or less than that, and that's a failure. People act like that's acceptable, and no one's saying anything. So I asked her, do you think there are different concerns in raising African American girls and African American boys in Rollin Acres, or are they similar? Ms. Turner said, I think they're different. I think that's from what I've seen. No matter what your educational background or whatever, you have to fight for the boys because they just lump them in a category. For example, with both Jason and Jack, I had to go in and tell them that they will be in advanced algebra class. I don't care what you say. You're not going to discourage me. They're going to get into that class. Because it's very interesting. That's where they try to shut your kid down. You go in and it's even a mix of black kids, and it's the 6th grade and it's 95% white. That's where they shut them out so they can never get back on track. And I was warned from other black parents about this, that this was going to happen. Ms. Turner, from firsthand experience, was frustrated with the ways that black boys were categorized as an undifferentiated mass. In the case of her family, she and her husband held master's degrees, boasted 6-figure salaries, but she felt that they were treated with less regard than their white counterparts with similar background characteristics. Additionally, she believed that her sons, who came from an affluent background, had been lumped in with lower-income black males. Her comments connote a desired distance between the black poor and the black middle class. This desired distance is often tied to the fear that close association with the black poor will influence one's treatment and one's subsequent life trajectory. On one occasion, such an occurrence happened with Jeffrey, who I mentioned earlier. He was the son of an attorney, and he revealed to his mother that at the breakfast table, his mom comes out, says, what do you want for breakfast? He says, I don't need breakfast. She's like, sure you do. You're 9. He's like, no. He's like, no. I get free breakfast. She's like, what do you mean you get free breakfast? And he goes, Mom, all the black kids get free breakfast. The teachers take us off the playground in the morning and they tell us to line up for breakfast. So I go and I get the breakfast. Jeffrey's mother assured me that she would address that issue with the school. In Rollin Acres, black boys were treated similarly, regardless of their class status, and this treatment was rarely favorable. From social promotion to being ushered into the free breakfast line, black parents were concerned that their son's treatment with school was troubling and that they had to fight for them constantly. Struggles with academics, however, were not the only hazard that black families faced with their sons. I'm going to turn to some of the more social dimensions. And these are, again, concerns as articulated by parents. A thematic concern that resurfaced with multiple black mothers in particular was their sons' dating preferences. While nearly all parents expressed fourth grade was too early for students to begin dating, they did notice the composition of their sons' classrooms, social circles, and nascent preferences. Jeffrey's mother, Ms. Tolles, expressed her concerns. And I try to think that I'm not racist, but I am. I don't have a problem admitting my faults. See, they are what they are. He has already at the ripe old age of fourth grade shown a definite attraction to white girls. And I will say to him, well, Jeffrey, what about Destiny? She's in his class, she's biracial, but certainly she has more African American features about her. It's a very attractive young lady. And he'll say, oh, I don't like her. She's too bossy. She's too this. Ms. Tolles continues, so I already see that he has these kinds of perceptions about women of color, and that is a problem for me. And having already raised one child in Rollin Acres who had a really horrible experience, an African American girl couldn't get a date, even if she was attractive. A beautiful black girl couldn't get a date in Rollin Acres to save a life because all the black boys were dating white girls. So that's a huge concern for me. Would I move to a city where there were more black people to change it? No, I'm not going to do that, but I wish there was a way to address this because I see it way more than I'm comfortable with because all of his friends are the same. They all date and are attracted to white girls. Ms. Tolles, like many mothers, feared that their sons would not just date white girls, but exclusively do so. In Tolles' comments, it could be perceived as racism as she identified it, but an alternative perspective is a concern less with who her son dates, but more his valuation of blackness. With other mothers, they suggested that if their sons could see black girls as attractive, they worried if Rollin Acres immersed their children in a culture that valued whiteness so much, yet produced few messages about racial pride. In response to this, black parents actively socialized their children regarding race-related barriers and messages of racial pride. Still, these messages were mediated by the lived experience which concerned black mothers. Contrastingly, black fathers suggested concerns about who their sons selected as mates. When asked about it, most suggested that they only thought about their son's self-image, but not necessarily about them dating white girls as an issue or an issue of self-image. Black fathers often said, it's not that deep. Black fathers, however, found another social aspect that they keyed in on often. Black fathers stressed the role of peer influence on their son's academic performance and school choices. Mr. James, the father of a son and a daughter, stressed that he was, quote, at war with cool. He said, I'm at war with cool. The reason why is because I went to Rollin Acres Public Schools and I understand what cool is. So the definition of cool is you sit down in your chair, kind of slumping. Right now you have your pants that are off your tail and you're not smart, you don't go to school, and so I don't want my kid to go through that. And he hasn't. And that's one of the reasons we made the decision to take him out of public schools. At this age right now, he was 10 years old, is when they start the process. The little kids at church that are all his age now, they have their hats on, kind of in the back, and they're cool. And they're talking a totally different language now. Last year, it used to be regular. Now they're cool. See, that's my struggle. And my struggle is, I was in school, my struggle is that I was in school, and I was kind of trying to remain a part of the world, but also be plugged in to a different part of the world. But most of the people that I knew, most of them were too busy being cool, and they never worked in both worlds. Mr. James and other black fathers felt that black boys were sucked into a cultural vortex that valued the aesthetic of cool over school achievement. Although this view is reductionist, it was a dominant frame used by well-to-do black families. styles of dress were often used as a marker that connoted how serious a young male was about his academic career and his future. Sagging pants and hats worn backwards signaled allegiance to a hip-hop version of cool that they assumed to be anti-intellectual. Keynote assumed. In parents' interpretation, the notion of a hip-hop cool was tied to a racial authenticity of boys, which suggested if a young black boy did not dress in a certain way, listen to a particular music, and speak in a certain form, that they were not accepted among black cliques. Most of the critiques of black male modalities of cool came from parents and teachers, but youth rarely drew distinctions between children and their orientation towards school and mobility based on their dress. This was more through an adult lens. Cool was sabotaging the future of black boys for families who were middle class. One way of avoiding this was having a son struggle with cool was to enroll him in a school of choice. During my observations, black males and white males demonstrated culturally similar practices. For example, they often listened to hip hop or pop music. Black boys wore certain styles, but when it was on a black body, it was read differently by adults. Black parents who sent their children to schools of choice routinely said that it was extremely difficult to be cool and high achieving. However, they said that in schools of choice, students were often bound by a culture of high achievement and a sense of cool that was not anti-intellectual. Although there is no way to determine whether these estimations were accurate, the accuracy of their claim is less important than their perceptions, because their perceptions drove them away from public schools. While I did not observe black boys wearing clothes that were drastically different than white boys, black parents were particularly attuned to what they perceived as an anti-academic and pro-cool culture. Multiple fathers suggested in their upbringings that they had to navigate this dilemma and anticipated their sons would soon face this challenge. While never explicitly invoking the fear of acting white theory, they questioned if racial authenticity would soon govern their sons' choices in and outside of school. The fear of black male youth culture as deficit was famously theorized by Majors and Billings in Cool Pose. In some interpretations of the Cool Pose theory, social acceptance among black peers trumps the need to conform to mainstream cultural expectations. Now, there's been boatloads of studies that have challenged this and said, quite frankly, black boys can wear their clothes how they want, can listen to the music they want, and achieve well. But for parents, this is why they chose to avoid schools and often tried to create distance between who they perceive to be lower income African Americans and who they perceive to be middle income African Americans. The last area of concern that I want to speak about is entering the real world. Black parents were concerned that by raising their kids in suburbs, they were disconnected to the real world. Ms. Tolles shared some concerns about her son. She was concerned that her son would be ostracized because he was not interested in black music. And in her words, he was, quote, a little effeminate. She worried if children teased Jeffrey, he would feel disconnected from black culture. She said, so I think it's important for me to make sure he's in an environment where an environment where that kind of race and gender teasing and taunting won't be tolerated, and where people, men in particular, put an end to it. Hopefully, African American men put an end to it. My goal is to get him into Parker Middle School, which is a school of choice in Rollin Acres, where he has an African American man who will validate him as he is. Not that he has to be rough, and not that he has to be tough, but he can be a nice kid who opens doors for women and says thank you and good morning and it's okay. And I'm not sure he's getting that at the elementary school he's in now. He certainly didn't get it at his previous school. Ms. Tolles actively sought mentors for Jeffrey and actively wanted to make sure that if Jeffrey's, in her terms, effeminate ways were connected to something else, he would be supported. In her quest for mentoring and modeling, she literally sent her son on a rotation of different mentors, from the Boys and Girls Club to karate to different college campuses, right, in search of an affirming black male figure. Jeffrey's father was in the picture, but in and out of the picture. And Jeffrey's father had not created a deep connection with him, and so she suggested that that was the community's role. But being located in Rollin Acres meant she had less access to the type of community that she would have in a predominantly black space. One of the other issues that parents expressed was the disconnect around class and race among boys. Miss Winters, who was a professor at a local university, discussed the dilemmas of socializing her son, who she sent to a religious school instead of a public school. She said, I come from a low-income background. My husband, he comes from a middle-class background, but he grew up in a low-income community. So we have both race and class concerns about raising our son in Rollin Acres. The racial concerns are tied to the kind of inequities we see, the discrimination that occurs, particularly in the public school system, and whether black children get a sense of their efficacy and their abilities in contexts like this, given those kind of inequalities. At the same time, because we're middle class, we also don't want our son to demonize the poor, or somehow think we're better than the black poor. And at the same time, we don't want him to romanticize the black poor. So there's this whole strange thing going on. And I really don't want him to become that kind of black person who goes to college and who grew up in one of these communities. They come to college from places like Rollin Acres, and then they get there and they're blacker than thou. I'm like, just be yourself. Be comfortable in your skin. So I feel like there's this whole dance, and I find it's really hard to manage all of that in this context. That dance of management across class, that dance of management across context, was one that parents were often concerned about and found their own ways to negotiate. Parents worried that as their children grew in age, they would have to deal with issues of race, class, and gender in a more overt manner. Mr. James shared, Rollin Acres, it's like a big cocoon. See, these kids here, they ain't worldly. It's a nice little, open yet closed community that's safe. And that's the right way. That's Midwest and all that. But a lot of the kids are so cocooned. They go out to the real world where, you have diverse personalities, and there's mean people out there who do mean things, and, so forth. These kids, they just have a hard time adjusting. For black parents, one common concern about black boys was their ability to code switch, was their ability to operate across environments. Ironically, the frame of being attached to one system of cool was advanced by black adults, but rarely reified by their children. I found that over time, parents did a lot of jumping back and forth to try to find the right environment for their child, ultimately settling on one and toughing it out. If we are to look at the situation of black boys in the suburbs, there are a couple lessons I think we can pull. First, academic engagement should not be assumed, it should be observed. The distance between the black community and Rollin Acres often meant that there were assumptions about low-income African Americans and assumptions about middle-class African Americans that were not actually connected to the data of lived experience. Two, the concern that black families felt around public schools' treatment of black boys, around lumping them together, was often fought in an individual manner, rarely in a collective mode. In part, this is because black parents often felt the only thing of concern was the achievement gap. Being shoveled into a free lunch line wasn't as much of a problem, wouldn't get written up in the paper, and wouldn't be taken seriously. Oftentimes, black parents were not given the same latitude or the same power to advocate for their children and receive different institutional reception. Three, the social worlds that black boys existed in were certainly multiracial, but questions of ethnic value and self-love were paramount for black mothers, particularly as women of color watching boys of color not choose their peers of color. This was a concern. While black fathers rarely brought up interracial dating, black mothers often did. This cell that exists between power and self and desire is important to consider. When we take all of those things together, when we recognize that there are unique ways that gender matters for boys, and if you invite me back later, I'll tell you about the girls' side, right? Then we can actually have a different conversation about what we need in schools. First, we have to recognize that most of our research has omitted half of the black community. The more we omit those who exist in suburbs, those who are middle class, the less we actually know about the black educational terrain, and the less we can develop dynamic responses to it. Second, the dominance of the crisis of the black male has taken away a gendered critique of education. Instead of actually doing the work of looking at the intersections of gender of race and of class, we assume that black boys are the only ones in peril. 3, race remains salient whether you're in the suburbs or in the city. While scholars for a while have been writing that in urban areas race matters little because it's predominantly black or high minority, in schools like the ones I observed in Rollin Acres, every day there was a negotiation of race, but there often wasn't language to deal with that negotiation. And 4, gender, class, and race-targeted interventions are underexplored. We often look for the silver bullet in education. My Brother's Keeper almost exclusively concentrates on high poverty, high minority schools, and often exclusively concentrate on males rather than both groups. I hope by sharing a little bit about the experiences and thinking about gender, we can have a conversation about the path forward. Thank you.